Works, and now you see the opening slide. Is that correct?
We do.
Yes. Okay. Great. So this is right. Just giving a little background on where I'm coming from. So I'm coming from the field of cognitive linguistics, which then has a number of different approaches within it, but the basic idea being trying to find out more about how our language use tells us about how we think about different things. And how we capture our concepts in different ways in language and communication. So part of that is looking at least in what I do, is looking at gesture with speech as well. So it's not only the words that people are using, but also how they're combining that together with the visual side of what they're doing in terms of gesturing with speech. And so as Scott mentioned, I'm also affiliated with Moscow State Linguistic University, where we set up a lab there on multimodal communication and cognition, where we're doing a number of different projects. We finished one on grammatical aspect and gesture. So looking at several different languages, namely Russian, French, and German, and looking at how the different grammatical tense and aspect forms are used by speakers and what they're doing when they're using these different forms, and then seeing some differences between how they're representing events in different ways, both in speech and in gesture. And currently we're working on a project on simultaneous interpreters and what they're doing in the interpreting booth when they're trying to interpret between Russian and English, and then we're also going to look at Russian and German. And the idea being to see how gestures are being used for themselves, because basically they don't have an audience. They're sitting in the interpreting booth doing their work. And the question is, what role does this multimodal component or this multimodal ensemble of speech and gesture, how does that work when they're really using it for themselves? And so that's something we just started on last year. And we've already, with our data collection, seeing lots of interesting things going on. Amazing what the people are doing, even though they know they're not doing it for an explicit audience. So that's a whole other topic. But today I'd like to talk about metaphor and gesture and thought as well. And I'd like to start with something that's a little bit unusual, but since we're looking at imagery in different ways and speech and gesture, I'd like to start with an image. And those of you who have studied Greek at all might recognize the middle word here, or at least part of this. You see something with metaphores in there. And you might wonder, why does a truck or a lorry have a word metaphor on it? And it turns out that this is, in modern Greece, what is used to move house from one place to another. It's a moving truck in contemporary terms. And of course, this comes from our roots, the Greek roots, having to do with bearing or carrying something from one place, as it were, to another, which we can also see in the Latin roots as well. That's actually the same roots as we have in transport, which we have in English. So if we look at what metaphor has to do with in terms of its real origins, then we come back to these real basic questions. I just need to move something around here on the screen. Okay, yeah. So the main topics of what we're going to be dealing with here then are these issues of metaphor in language and in thought. Is it the same thing? If we're talking about metaphor in language, is it the same thing as saying that that was what someone is thinking about metaphorically? And how does this carry over to gesture then? In what ways does that carry over to the things that speakers are doing when they're talking? We'll also be looking at to what extent this representation of abstract ideas in gesture with metaphor is the same as the representation of physical things with gesture. And so this will get us some bigger questions of how does metaphoric conceptualization get expressed in different ways, and is it the same as representing physical forms with gesture? We'll also raise this question of, is gesture use with speech just a mirror or a kind of redundant aspect? Are the metaphors that we're using in gesture just copying those that we're using in speech? And then we'll have some consideration of how does this all relate to if we look at meaning as a kind of mental simulation of some ideas, into what degree does looking at gesture provide additional insights into that as well? So this gets us into some questions of semantics and cognition and conceptualization as well. So this issue of the degrees to which metaphor that we see as a verbal phenomenon, the degree to which it also reflects ways of thinking of one thing or another, actually goes back quite a long ways, and some claim as early as Aristotle, but at least in terms of 19th century work, and some German scholars, as summarized by Jäckel and Müller, also addressed this issue in some ways. And later, Richards presented it this way, where he said the traditional theory of metaphor made metaphor seem to be a verbal matter, a shifting and displacement of words, or as fundamentally as borrowing between an intercourse of thoughts. And this is the basic idea that we still have today in terms of how people think about or write about and research metaphor as possibly relating to different ways of in which we conceptualize one thing in terms of another. So Richard said thought is metaphoric and proceeds by comparison, and the metaphors of language derive therefrom. So this is a very similar idea to what we see in the conceptual metaphor theory that Lakoff and Johnson presented in their book in 1980, which many people have pursued since then, that metaphor of speech or language might in some way reflect ways of thinking of one thing in terms of another. What they call this mapping of patterns from one domain in terms of another. So just to go over this in case someone is not familiar with this approach, the basic idea being that we see evidence in language, certain expressions like here talking about how the mind itself works. If we say that my brain is running out of steam, or that someone's a little rusty when it comes to thinking about some topic, or I see the gears turning when someone's thinking, these expressions in yellow then reflect the general pattern of talking about thinking or the mind as some kind of mechanical device, maybe a machine in some way. And the idea is that these verbal expressions, if we see a number of them, they tend to maybe form a group that then represents a more general pattern. And this is the idea that was pursued in this conceptual metaphor theory, that it represents a kind of mapping between two different domains of some kind of structure. The structure of how machines work is used to then think about and talk about how the mind itself works. So if we try to map this ourselves in a certain way, and seeing how we think about this, what we know about the source domain, a machine, how we use it to think about the mind, this was expressed in a really elegant way by Corradi Fiumara, who has this great book called The Metaphoric Process. And what she says is there's a kind of semantic motion that's implicit in the word metaphor. She says the motion, phora, is a symbolic motion, the double imaginative act of outreaching and combining that essentially marks the metaphoric process. So she put it in a quite elegant way that this mapping is then more than just a static thing of a structure that's then used in another place, but rather it's really a dynamic process. And this is one of the points of her book. She's a philosopher herself, that this that metaphor as a phenomenon is actually a dynamic process that plays out in different ways. And this becomes quite relevant when we start thinking about gesture with speech as well, a dynamic phenomenon. So to use this little diagram of this source and target kind of idea, we have on the one level different expressions. So to go back to Shakespeare, Juliet is the sun. We have a literal referent to the person we're referring to, and then some metaphoric way of talking about her, thinking of sun having to do with warmth, and then maybe emotion or affect in some way. And in other terms, some people talk about the topic that's being talked about in terms of a certain vehicle term that's used. If we think about it, though, we often use metaphor without mentioning what the topic is, so that the target domain is often optional in metaphor use. If we just say, my sunshine has entered the room, meaning somebody who has a cheery personality, and we know who we're talking about, we don't need to mention that person by name. And this is something that comes up frequently in metaphor use. All of those examples I just gave, we didn't mention the mind itself. It was something that was implicit. And this is a kind of trick with metaphor analysis. How do we get at what that target domain is when it's often not even mentioned explicitly. And this is where moving beyond verbal data might provide us with some additional insights. So on the one hand, we have looking at verbal data as a way of trying to get at metaphoric thinking. It's expressing certain ideas. But there's also a problem in that if we're using language, and especially language as we write it out, as our evidence or our data for trying to understand metaphor, we lose the idea, or we lose sight possibly of the idea that metaphor is a way of thinking and engaging in different behaviors. And so Per Linnell has written a whole book about the written language bias in linguistics, saying that it's a problem that we often then assume that language, whether it's written or spoken, is the same thing, that it's a neutral form, that in fact we have fundamental differences between spoken language use and written language use. And so what I want to object to is this objectified view of metaphor, and actually say that that's a problem. And so looking at spoken language use can help get us away from that problem, especially if we start looking at what speakers are doing. And this is where we get into gesture. So what about gesture? Just a little background. We don't know of any culture in which speakers never gesture. And if you think about it, it's bizarre to just picture someone standing there not moving at all while they're talking. If it's a robot, you start thinking it's a kind of robotic form of communication. So there's something about gesture that then is connected with speech production, which seems very important. From other research in psychology, we know that if you're prevented from gesturing, it also affects your ability to speak and affects it in a negative way. So there are more restarts, more hesitation, and also some people have found there's less use of spatial language. And so we actually think about topics differently when we cannot move when we're talking about them. If we think about gesture itself, it's a broad category. Especially if we take Adam Kendon's definition, where he then talked about a visible, distinct, effortful movement of part of the body. So that then leaves it open and quite broad in terms of what we could call gesture. And I'd like to narrow it down for our purposes today and just talk about manual gesture and focus on hand gestures as a special category. The hands are very special in terms of their ability to represent different forms, the degree to which they can articulate different forms, the physiology of the hands, the bones, the muscles, the dexterity that we have with the hands is very different than what we have with our elbow or our head or our knees or other body parts. So the hands provide special opportunities for us, and also their location in terms of often being visible when you're speaking to someone affords certain use with communication and complementing what we're saying with speech. So if we look at the study of metaphor in gesture, it actually goes back quite a ways, and we can see some work by Wundt going back to his work on talking about time expression and how speakers, questioning why is it that speakers might point to the front or to the back when talking about the future or the past, if they're speakers of European languages. And so it started to raise this question of this connection then between how abstract ideas might be expressed in gesture as well as in speech. And David McNeill is one of the first people to have picked up on Lakoff and Johnson's ideas about metaphor, and actually started looking into this as a metaphoric gestures as a kind of gesture. So he did a lot of research, and is one of the people who really started the field of gesture research in the late 20th century with his book Hand and Mind in 1992. And also Geneviève Calbry writing about this somewhat in French gesture, giving some different examples that show this as well. And this is something that then I picked up on after that, also Yves Sweetser, Cornelia Miller, in a number of different works, which then led to our book in 2008 on metaphor and gesture, an edited volume. And there's been a good bit of research on different languages since then as well, and also questioning some of these assumptions from European languages and seeing different things happening in non-European languages as well. So how do gestures represent ideas? If we think about talking about words and metaphoric use of words, we have basic meanings of words that we can refer to. We can look in a dictionary. But for gesture, spontaneous gesture, it's not sign language. That's a different phenomenon, really, than to look at the sign language where you have agreed upon codified forms of representing different concepts. Spontaneous gesture with speech is just that, more spontaneous, more idiosyncratic, and we don't have dictionaries for many kinds of gestures except those that really have fixed forms, those so-called emblems, that then if you say thumbs up, and that means great in your culture, you can take a picture of someone doing that and then give a definition for it. But for most of the movements that people are making when they're speaking, it's hard to capture them in that same way, and the meanings are not as fixed that go with them. So what Cornelia Miller did is looked at different means by which gestures can represent physical ideas, and it turns out also abstract concepts as well, in terms of what she called these Darstellungsweisen, or these modes of representation. So I'd like to just give an overview of those briefly so that we have that as a kind of tool that we can use to look at how we can interpret gestures as being metaphorically used in different contexts. For some of these, I'll have this little image for taking down photos, just to remind you, because these are taken from research that I did many years ago, and I don't have permission from the participants to share these images. So that's the idea with that. These are from a study that I did looking at how American students talk about how they take exams at the university and what they think honest behavior is when they're taking an exam. So, honesty versus cheating in an exam. How do they talk about these abstract concepts? And I was comparing it with Russian students and looking at how they talk about these concepts and seeing what some similarities and differences are. So we have some of these examples where the students were talking about an essay exam where you have to write quickly. And so by the hand shape and also by the movement he was making back and forth, we can infer that that's might be like how you're holding a pen, for example, or a pencil, and he's talking about writing at the same time. So even though it's not like we actually write on paper, there's something different in terms of the direction that we're using and things. But we have a basic idea. We can enact certain forms of behavior like we might normally do them. So this is one fundamental mode of representation. Sometimes we also show, for example, what we're writing on. This was one of the Russian students was talking about taking copying an answer on an exam, copying a question from another exam. And he was showing his left hand sort of like the piece of paper. So we sometimes embody something as well as enacting something. So embodying what he's doing with the left hand is another one of these modes of representation where your hand is something. You see it sometimes if your hand is, can be the pencil sometimes, and you might talk about writing something like that, or different ways of embodying. Sometimes we as if hold or touch something. Here the student was talking about an essay exam and showing a piece of paper. So sometimes you as if hold something between your hands, and then we see the edges of it. So this is another way in which we can represent something. Sometimes you're actually like physically with your hands facing each other as if holding something. And sometimes we trace different forms. So the student was talking about drawing a line, and actually then with his extended index finger made a vertical line going down. So tracing, as it were, in the air is another way in which we can show different forms, especially outlines of different two-dimensional forms. Taken together, these four modes cover all the different possibilities, at least as far as it's been found, in terms of how we can represent something with gesture. It's surprising that it boils down to four different modes, but it's hard to think of some other way in which you can represent something and it doesn't fit one of these different kinds of categories. If we think about the literal kind of representation we're doing, which we can call an iconic mapping, the form of what we're representing, there's, let's say, the piece of paper with the flat hand, bears some similarity in form to the gestural way in which we are representing it. So something about the structure, there's a kind of structure mapping, this iconicity between the form of the thing being represented and the actual form of expression. If we then think about abstract ideas, how do we have that, how can we have that same kind of iconicity? Because if the idea is abstract, it doesn't have its own physical spatial form, And this is where we start getting into this question of how does metaphor work in gesture? How can we have a metaphoric mapping if we don't have the original spatial form to refer to? Just to give an example of this, this is from a TV news program where the reporter is talking about this guy who was accused of espionage, and what he says is that he holds dual citizenship, and here's what he does.
He holds dual citizenship.
Just to show that again.
He holds dual citizenship.
So he gives us this hand shape, this kind of cupped hand shape, which is then how you might actually hold something like a cup in terms of the curved shape and the orientation of the hand, the location of where it is in front of you. But we're talking about citizenship, which is something you possess in some way, but that you don't physically hold. So we already start to see this, how this kind of mapping works then between the abstract idea of having some kind of citizenship and physical action that might go with that in terms of physically holding and showing that. So we start to see how we can represent abstract ideas in terms of a spatial form, this topic in terms of some kind of vehicle, by using ideas from what is then in metaphoric terms the source domain, so holding the physical action like you might hold a physical object, to talk about something more abstract having to do with possessing some kind of category, having a certain status, like your citizenship, for example. We then realize that what we're doing is perhaps the same thing as we might do to represent physically holding a cup. So we're drawing upon this physical mapping and then basically using that idea to then represent the spatial idea. So this abstract idea gets mapped onto the physical form of the concrete thing that we're talking about, and then we're representing that in some way in gesture. So it's in some ways kind of a double mapping that we have with metaphor and gesture. We're always showing something physical to talk about something abstract. One question is then, are these similar or are they different? Are they the same thing or not? We might expect from conceptual metaphor theory that these would really be the same, that every time we talk about holding something physical, that it would be the same as when we talk about holding a different status, for example. And this isn't a big question because if we want to look at or question or test conceptual metaphor theory, we might then expect to see these same patterns coming across in metaphoric gesture as in gestures of the physical. So the question is, to what degree is that really true? And this is something that was researched by one of my former master's students, who is now one of my PhD students, Yao Tong, who looked into this question, specifically comparing gestures of the physical and gestures of the abstract. And now she's doing her PhD on abstract ideas being represented in gesture in different ways, extending from this master's work. But she looked at this in two ways. And one was in terms of the frequency of the gestures. Are gestures that are being used to talk about physical ideas being used as frequently or more or less than they are to talk about abstract ideas? So are abstract and physical being used the same amount? And the other was to look at the forms of the gestures. Are these forms of the metaphoric gestures the same as those would be used to talk about something physical? And she used what to many of you will be a well-known database, this so-called Red Hen Lab, based on the UCLA Library Broadcast Newscape, and specifically looked at the set of the American TV shows on there and captured from that many different examples of action verbs to then look at reference to the physical and reference to the abstract. So she used this interface. This was from 5 years ago. Now there are also more modern tools to do some of this analysis, but this is a basic way to then look within a certain time frame at all of the instances that she could pull up of these given verbs for manual actions. So she specifically focused on this set of verbs, so looking at push, pull, lift, pick, and hold. And the idea with manual action verbs was that these are actions for which we do real physical actions, because there are many kinds of actions that we don't do with our hands. And looking at them would provide a way to see how often are they used to talk about the abstract and how often the physical. So she looked at all of the different forms of these verbs, the different conjugated forms, and turned up some 100 examples for each of these, so 2,000, but then had to eliminate sort of cleaning up the data, ones where the transcription was actually wrong from the closed captions that came with the videos and things. Ended up with 1,704 examples, and then looked at the frequency of these in terms of the different verbs. So the big picture, which was actually surprising to us, was that she found so many metaphorical uses compared to the physical, literal uses of these verbs. And this was actually then statistically quite significant difference here. But also in terms of the gesture, then there was more metaphoric use of gesture than literal use of gesture. Not as extreme a difference as we saw with the verb use, but in terms of the gesture use with the verbs, there was still more metaphoric than literal use. So that raises some other kinds of questions. And if we divide it up according to the different verbs, we also see a differentiation in terms of which verbs were used more with these gestures metaphorically or not. So pull and push being the big ones, but then some others less so and more, not as enormous a difference then between them. So the initial conclusion here is that it's then not necessarily the case that we're using the gestures more to talk about the physical world, but in fact, using them more to talk about these abstract ideas, which already suggests something about activation of thinking of these spatial and motoric concepts where we're using the metaphors to talk about these different ideas. And the next question is then, what about the forms that we have of these gestures? Are they the same or different for these different kinds of uses, abstract and concrete? So to start with just some examples from the pushing, let's take a look at what some of these examples showed. So here we have 3 different examples. Take the first one.
Don't do something that pushes them into a corner.
Don't do something that pushes them into a corner. So we have this kind of flat handshake, like pushing something rather large maybe, but talking about forcing people to do something, pushing them into a corner. Next example.
TSA procedures all the time. They're pushing protocols to the very limit.
They're pushing protocols to the very limit. And so then again, these kind of flat handshapes going towards the center, moving something inward. Take the next example.
Amy's used to like really pushing the envelope. Is there
Amy's used to really pushing the envelope. So instead of trying to do things that are more extreme, let's say. So what's interesting in these 3 examples, we have flat hands, which might not be the way you would normally think of pushing something. And we'll see some physical examples now to compare with that. So here's one where the speaker is talking about physically pushing something. She was in a tornado and the house fell apart, came crashing down. She was in the basement and they had to get out of the basement by pushing the door that was on the ceiling above them. It's a little hard to hear the sound, but I'll describe what she did. If we tried to push the door open, she said. So here we have this motion clearly upward, talking about the actual scene that she was in, trying to push something. Here's another literal example of pushing.
pushing their babies in strollers?
She says pushing their babies in strollers, like in a pram, and she's showing the handshake that you might use and the location in front of her, moving her hands forward a little bit with that. And the third example, and with this red hand, you get all kinds of situations. You never know what's going to come up. So here is this priest bothering this woman on the plane, and the lawyer describes what the woman did.
Push the button for the flight attendant to come, because she was.
So push the button for the flight attendant to come. So the hand shape and the motion in terms of how you would actually do that with the button above you on the plane. So what we see is a difference between the forms that were being used for many of these in physical terms versus in abstract terms. Basically for the abstract use, there was a more limited range of forms. We saw a lot of the flat hand shapes here, and also the direction of movement. So it was often something that was just simply toward or away from them, located in a more central space, versus what we saw with the physical ones where they were using with different directions, especially upward or forward to do the pushing. And then we also saw this recurrence of the different kinds of forms of flat hand that was being used with the abstract motion as opposed to the physical sense. To take another example with pulling, if we take the abstract uses, take the first example.
You know, I had Santorum on. Santorum pulled Romney to the right, okay?
So we're talking about two politicians, and Santorum, one of them pulled Romney to the right, so meaning made him have more conservative positions on certain issues. And so we have this kind of, as if holding something between your hands and moving it to the right. Take the next example.
Where do you go if you want to pull down your tax returns from previous year?
So it's a little quiet there. She said, where do you go if you need to pull down your tax returns from previous years? So this is an online tax returns, and you're trying to find out what you submitted in previous years. So pulling them down, she uses, again, just kind of open hands towards herself, pulling them down. And a third example, this is the movie producer, and he was talking about if things were too extreme, then, and maybe disturbing for the audience, they tried to tone it down a little bit and pull back, he says.
Pull back if people are deeply troubled.
So he says they tried to pull back if people were deeply troubled, so they tried to do things that were less extreme. So we see something similar here in terms of these kind of loose hand shapes or open hand shapes, movement in the space in front of them, forward and back, recurring across these different forms. If we take the physical forms, and so now talking about situations of literally pulling, here they're talking about a car accident, and someone was then pulled out of the car that was there.
From the bystanders that night on the interstate, we pulled them out to.
So someone got pulled out of the car, so we see a grasping handshake, and then also movement to show as if it's kind of pulling. Here's another example where he's talking about a crime scene, and there was a chest of drawers, and then someone pulled out one of the drawers, and so he shows that.
Or neatly pulled out.
So neatly pulled out the drawer. So again, he shows a kind of grasping hand shape, and this is the image of the drawers he's talking about, pulled that which they used to pull out the drawers. And the third example here, this is again another disaster situation where there was a flood, and she was stuck in a house, and someone appeared and pulled her out of the house.
And this man just appeared and pulled me out.
So she's now representing him, pulling her out of the house. So again, a grasping hand shape, pulling towards herself. So we see with these physical cases, a number of instances showing the different hand shape, the physical action that goes with the pulling, and also different motions and directions that would be involved in this kind of pulling. So we see, similar to the pushing, this kind of difference between a more, let's say, generic forms that go with the abstract use and more specific detailed forms that go with the physical use. So it suggests that the metaphoric imagery for the abstract use might be relying more on what have been called lexical concepts. So Ellen Fricke did some research on this in terms of more semiotic terms, talking about how certain gestures might represent the interpreter's image that they're using of a concept rather than reference to an actual scene that might have been involved. And so if we're talking about any kind of physical pulling or pushing, we have a location in which it happened, and we have something we can refer to. Whereas if we're talking about the abstract idea, it's not tied to a specific concrete instance or physical props, let's say. And so it's more variable and flexible. So there might be a more generic kind of form that's used for those, which then actually raises some questions about the conceptual metaphor theory. It seems that maybe these concepts that we're drawing upon are not exactly the same as we use in the physical world when talking about reference to something. So the source domain concepts might be schematized in some way in that we see in the gesture. So that's a kind of interesting conclusion that can be drawn from some of this. Of course, this is just a small study, but it raises some questions. Maybe we need some refining of thinking about how this source domain is represented in terms of gesture. What does that reflect about how we conceptualize it in the abstract sense? One question is then, do the metaphorically used gestures require metaphorically used words with them? A lot of these, or maybe all of these examples that we've seen had a word that then went with the gesture. It was being used metaphorically. So if that's always the case, then you might just say the metaphor and gesture is a kind of decoration or add-on or redundant form of expression. So I'll present this little table as a way to break it down. And if we think about it, we have what is expressed. So are we talking about the target or the source in terms of the metaphors? And how is it being expressed? Is it being expressed in words, in gesture, or both? And this is where we can then try to tease apart, do we really have a multimodal form of expression here going across from one to another? Or are we just dealing with something on one level in terms of just words or gestures? Here's another example from the student study. And in this case, she was talking about there are times when students might be willing to push their moral limits or their judgments of what is right or wrong. And she actually then shows this with her left hand, the speaker on the right, as she's doing that. The timing is a little off between the video and the speech, but you get the basic idea here.
And I think that they're willing to push their moral limits or, their judgment of, what is right or wrong.
So she starts out with push and then moral limits, and then keeps using this flat hand shape to talk about this judgment of what's right or wrong. And so here we have both in the speech, talking about the target, pushing the judgment of what's right or wrong, and the source pushing limits also being shown with the gestures. So we get, in a sense, both of these forms, words and gestures representing the source domain, to get at this idea of some kind of moral judgments that we're making and where do they end. In some cases, though, we see people using metaphorically used gestures, or ones that we can interpret as metaphorically used, when there doesn't appear to be any obvious metaphor in the speech. So here's a student talking about someone who was very honest, and he does the following when he says that.
He's a very honest person. Like, can you say that? Or?
So he says he's a very honest person. He has a flat hand that he makes this kind of chopping motion with. Could have to do with the very, like extreme, could have to do with honest, it could be the combination. But if we take that flat hand and modes of representation, then it might be like something flat going down, maybe chopping something, maybe dividing up spaces, maybe showing some kind of contrast between one thing and another, something that's more absolute. And if we go with that interpretation, then the gesture is reflecting something that's different than what we're seeing in the words. We didn't have metaphorically used words there if we talk about very honest. And so we then see something that's going on differently in the gesture than in the speech. We take another example that's a little more, okay, let's take this example. Sometimes we have expressions for which you really could not have a gesture. So, Juliet is the sun. Okay, maybe you could show something, but maybe you didn't. But something like a dark day for democracy, if you think of like colors or light and dark, there's not a good way to show that in space exactly, unless you do something bizarre with like an enactment of making a shadow or something like that. We don't have obvious ways to spatialize those kinds of concepts. Not all concepts can be easily rendered in space. So sometimes we might have a target idea that's not explicitly mentioned and only known from context. So like here, what does dark day mean? We have to know it has to do with something bad, something negative. And so sometimes we might have an expression only in words and there isn't a gesture even possible. So then we're kind of stuck with the modal expression. But in some cases, we might have a gesture for which there's not a verbal equivalent. So here's an example, two other students talking about how they take exams and how they feel about it. And I'll just play the audio first and then we'll see the video.
I'm going to see.
Yeah, you should do that.
Right. You usually do better when you're just like,
And also,
so she says, you usually do better when you're just like, And he says, She doesn't really finish the utterance there. So if you just read it, you don't know exactly what she's talking about. If we see what's going on there, here's the same example. The student on the left is the one that's speaking here. We can see what she does.
I'm going to see.
yeah, you should do that.
Right. You usually do better when you're just like,
And also,
So you do better when you're just like, and she makes this, spreads out her hand and then puts it down. And it turns out earlier she was talking about being very tensed up, and she was making fists to talk about how it doesn't help to be tensed up during an exam. It's better to be more relaxed and take it that way. So in this case, the gesture filled in for the speech said to just like and then does something. So we also then have a monomodal metaphoric expression, as it were, if we take that as metaphoric, having to do with something about the quality of how she felt being shown in the spatial form, where we only know what it means from the context in which she's speaking. In some cases, though, there's something more complicated going on. Here, the student's talking about absolutes, and she says that there's some cases where either you're right or wrong, or things are black or white, and she does the following.
You know, there is no gradation. It's either you're right, you're wrong, black, white. You know, but
So she also shows this flat hand going down onto the other flat hand, making this kind of chopping gesture, having to do with this distinction of right or wrong, black or white. And since we can't show these black and white things in a spatial form, it turns into something else. It turns into some kind of division, maybe between two sides opposing each other, maybe a division between an absolute of black and white. So we get something different going on in the speech that's going on in the gesture. If we think about it, there's one metaphor in the speech of black and white and another spatial one in the gesture, combining to have to do with this target of something about an absolute distinction. And if we look at these little diagrams and think of what got filled in and what was left blank, it turns out there are two boxes that remain blank. One is the context for the source. That makes sense. The context is what we're talking about. It's not usually what we're using to represent something else unless you took something like an artifact and then made it into something else and said, this is a, and then identified what it was and used it as a prop. And the other is the target in the gesture. And this is interesting because then if you think about it, we're often talking about abstract ideas metaphorically when we're using gesture rather than representing a concrete thing in terms of another concrete thing. That happens sometimes, but less often. So how could you represent an abstraction with gesture? It automatically becomes physical. So it automatically turns into something that you have to show, which then is the source domain. So even if you just say, I have an idea, and you show it like as if it's something abstract that you're holding, you're already showing holding something. So it already becomes something physical. So this is a difference then that we have between metaphor in speech and gesture in terms of how they're being expressed and what the possibilities are. Do I just have a few more minutes here?
I think we have just a couple. That's fine.
A few more minutes, then.
3-4 minutes.
I can wrap up with this idea of how does this then relate to how we understand meaning. So there's a approach studying semantics in cognitive linguistics and also some in cognitive psychology, looking at what's called mental simulation. And it then, looking at gesture, also provides some additional insights into how this might be playing out. So in terms of language comprehension, the idea is that to understand the meaning of an utterance is to unconsciously project or imagine or simulate in some way the content of the words that you're using. And we also see that words that are describing motor actions actually induce mental activation of neural areas specific to the parts of the body they are performed with. So when you read about someone pushing something, you already activate some of the neurons that would then eventually connect to actually making you push something, but the connection doesn't go that far to actually make you do the action. But we then see in gesture how some of this might play out. We also know that listeners gain information from gesture which is not expressed in the accompanying speech. And so, for example, people talking about size or shape of something and showing it, but they didn't mention it verbally, listeners in these studies by Beattie and Shovelton, for example, the listeners picked up on this information. And there's an increasing amount of research then on how gestures might reflect some of these mental simulations. There's one task where they, so-called Tower of Hanoi task, where people had to move discs from one peg to another, only one at a time, and try to get all of the discs on this third peg in the same order as they were in the first one. And in this study, they also did the same thing, having people do it on a computer where they could click and drag the discs and move them. So just with their finger clicking and dragging, do the same tasks one by one, moving the discs from one to another to eventually pile them all onto the third one. And what they found is that when people did the task physically and they told someone else about it, and then the other people had to do it on the computer and just do it with clicking and dragging, they would still drag the disc up over this peg and try to put the disc on the other peg, as if they didn't realize they could just drag right through the image of the peg. So they took the peg as if it were something physical because they'd seen somebody showing how to move this thing. So the idea is that the information they got from seeing the gestures, actually they used it in solving the task. So this is some evidence that we do gain information from people's gestures, which then might reflect how they're thinking about something and might also get the other person to think about something. And I want to just use one example. This was from a former PhD student in Sorbonne Nouvelle University, Camille Desbras, who did this study with some other students. They collected conversations by students in Cambridge. Sorry, it wasn't at Oxford, it was in Cambridge, talking about the environmental issues. And here's one example. I'll just play the sound first and then we'll see the example.
Nuclear or fossil fuels or like recycling are quite big issues, whereas for me, say, biodiversity, while it's quite important, I'd say that takes a kind of, a back seat compared to, fossil fuels versus.
And what we see here is this idiom. So something takes a backseat to something else. It's considered less important than that, which he hesitates there, maybe is having trouble coming up with the idiom. And it turns out his partner already starts giving the words for that. And what we see happening here is that it also is playing out gestually, which might explain also how she already picked up on the idiom.
Nuclear or fossil fuels or like recycling are quite big issues, whereas for me, say, biodiversity, while it's quite important, I'd say that takes a kind of, back seat compared to, fossil fuels versus.
So we already see him producing the gesture and finishing it before they even started saying back seat, which then could be already giving her information about how to think about this idea in some way, perhaps getting her to simulate this idea. So if we just go over these topics that we had here, is that we're seeing metaphor and gesture playing out in different ways, but it's not the same thing as the metaphor in words, that there are some differences and maybe more schematic implementation of the source domain concepts versus how they're represented more specifically in words. It seems we also don't necessarily need metaphorically used words to have metaphoric gestures with them. And we then also see that maybe this is giving some information. It's not only useful for the speaker, it's maybe giving information to the addressee as well in terms of how to think about certain concepts. And I think looking at gesture also provides us ways of thinking about metaphor as a dynamic process. So that quote that we have from Fiumara, who's thinking about this kind of metaphor as dynamic thinking, but also it's dynamic in terms of how it's playing out in time as different speakers are using the metaphors. And we also see that then there can be schematization in how gestures are representing some of these ideas, which also might represent more schematic thoughts about some of these concepts. That's perhaps speculation, requires other kinds of testing, but we get some insights from looking at the gesture with the speech, and which might then bring us back to, like Evan Johnson claimed in the 1980 book, that the essence of metaphor is understanding and experiencing one kind of thing in terms of another. And so if we think of experiencing here as then the actions people are engaging with when they're speaking, then we do see that it clearly shows metaphors more than just a verbal phenomenon, that there are there's motoric activation being implemented in what people are doing when they are speaking. So I will leave it at that. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer any questions.